community of people that were regularly received. Some think that the Galileans who lived north of Samaria, and Jerusalem and Judah were south of Samaria, Galileans, rather than enter into Samaria to go down the quickest route, they would cross over the Jordan River and then cross on the east side of the Jordan, go down, and then cross back over west and into Jerusalem. And of course, they'd come through Bethany before they got there. So Bethany could have been a location where you had poor pilgrims and that were there kind of making their way to Jerusalem. And they did that because Samaria, well, you can kind of see if they traveled that far extra around it just to avoid going to Samaria, you can see kind of what they thought of the Samaritans as we remember that parable of the Good Samaritan. So if that's the case, and people are coming that way regularly, pilgrims coming through, if it was a community where poor were living, when Jesus says the poor will always be with you, in a sense what he's saying is look around. This is the context of where we are in Bethany. And so it's not as harsh as it seems, taken from that kind of perspective. And in that setting, Jesus is in the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and Mary comes forward and she anoints Jesus' feet with perfume that's very expensive. They said 300 denarii would have fed a family for a year there in Bethany. And so, this is a very generous and very extravagant display of affection for Jesus. And the disciples are saying, well, what in the world is she doing? We could have used that money and sold it for the poor. And probably that's what they would have done 9 times out of 10. Maybe 9 out of 100 times, maybe that's what they would have done. But this time was a time for Mary to show Jesus how much she cares about him. Jesus has been setting up the disciples all through this, leading up to this point. Jesus has been telling them, when we go to Jerusalem and when this happens, there's going to be suffering and death, and I'll be raised again. And he keeps telling them this, and they probably are kind of thinking, well, yeah, whatever. But maybe Mary was the one who listened. It says in Luke's gospel that she sat at Jesus' feet. That's a kind of a euphemism for disciple. Mary was just like a disciple. She was the one listening, and as she took all this in and she listened and realized we're about to go to Jerusalem. We're just a couple miles out. It's coming. And if there's any time to tell Jesus what he means to me, now is the time. And so for Mary, this time was the right time. You ever have things kind of coalesce in just the right moment where things all kind of come together and you just realize this is the right time. The moment is now. We got to move. I think that's what it was for Mary. The Greeks have 2 different words for time. One is chronos, and they use that word like it's the root of chronological, and we think of that as orderly time, kind of like when we say we lost an hour of sleep last night. That would be chronos time, as we talk about that as we move forward. But they also had a word for time called kairos time, and kairos was God's time. It's that time when it all just comes together perfectly. It's when we are enjoying it and being in the moment, and it's so real to us that it seems as if just for that moment time stands still. That's God's time. And that's what Mary does when she anoints Jesus with this perfume and wipes his feet with her hair. And it's a foreshadowing of what is going to happen as he talks about, this is for my burial. He realizes and recognizes, she's getting me ready. What does it mean to engage in God's time? There's a study I read in the New Yorker on resilience. It's in the February issue, and Maria, let me get the author's name correctly. I don't want to mess that up. Maria Konnikova was the author, and she wrote about Norman Garmazzi, who was a developmental psychologist at the University of Minnesota, and he studied children and resilience in particular. And they wanted to know, what is that factor, that it factor? Why do some people resilient and some people, why are they not resilient? This is a very hard thing to study because resiliency happens when we encounter adversity, right? And so nobody wants to sign up for a study on resilience. I don't want you to know if I'm resilient or not because I don't want to have to be tested, right? Nobody wants that. So we don't know how resilient we are until bad things occur to us and we have adversity. But they were studying children, so over time they could kind of see and point out. And this one child in particular, his 9-year-old boy, stood out to Garmese. And as he looked at this one child, he said he was just a resilient kid. He had nothing going for him. His mother was an alcoholic, and his dad was nowhere to be found, absentee dad. And so here's this kid, and he comes to school every day with a smile on his face. And he always brought a sandwich with him as well from home for his lunch. And the sandwich had one piece of bread and another piece of bread, and you put them together, and there was nothing in the middle. It was a bread sandwich. They didn't want anybody to know that his mother was incompetent or couldn't provide for her, that his family was poor. He didn't want any pity from anyone. And so he brought that sandwich every day, and he brought a smile on his face, and he went to school. A resiliency. What makes him resilient when nothing's going for him? Everything's against him. Emma Warner also studied and was quoted as a psychologist studying resiliency, and she said that as we look at psychologically, what makes us resilient is that we have this internal locus of control. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that we believe we're in charge. We believe we have free will. We believe that all these things that can happen to us do not chart our destiny. We are the ones in charge of what we're going to do. We determine how we're going to respond in the face of adversity. Are we going to come with a smile on our face? Or are we going to let it get us down? The children who were shown in this article to be resilient believed that they orchestrated their own fate. Isn't that marvelous to think about for us? I believe that Mary was resilient, and she saw these things coalescing, these things happening, and Jesus is moving, and history is moving him towards the cross, and she says, I'm going to act now, despite all these things, and I'm going to do something for him. And it's going to be something powerful. This is the time. This is the moment. I grew up in Oklahoma. I was born in Minnesota. Some of you may not know that. I was not born here. I was born in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and it was a long time ago. My parents decided to move to Oklahoma about 6 weeks after I was born, and I decided to follow them to Oklahoma, grow up here. And grew up in Tulsa. A lot of my friends grew up, when I was growing up in school, were Dallas Cowboys fans. But I always liked the Vikings because I was from Minnesota. I had never visited there. We never went back. We didn't have relatives up there or anything like that. It was for a work-related move. And so I didn't know anything about it except for what I heard from my parents telling me stories about it. But I knew I was from Minnesota, so I was always a Vikings fan. And that could be a certain frustrating thing as you follow the Vikings, if you ever followed them. Purple is probably the sign of the Vikings. I think they're purple people eaters, those kind of things, and back in their day. But it's also for the Lenten color, the sign of suffering, so that fits, I think. Anyway, they made the playoffs this year, first time in 3 years they made the playoffs, and we're excited about it. And they're playing the Seahawks in the first playoff game, and they're struggling back and forth, and they're down by 1 point, and they're down 10-9. They drive the ball, and they're getting ready to kick a field goal, and it's only a 27-yard or a chip shot, for NFL kicker. They should make that easily. And final seconds are wearing down the game, and he misses. He missed. Blair Walsh missed the game. And so, the thing about missing on the last kick of the game when you lose or win a game that way, you could have 100 mistakes throughout the game, but what's everybody going to remember? They remember that kick, right? If you just hit the kick, you would have won it. And so social media erupted on Walsh, and they started sending all this hate mail and all this kind of stuff, and the internet and everything else to talk about it. They said stuff like they invited Walsh to leave the state. That was one of the nicer things they said, to this kicker. And so you have all this hate. But you also had a first-grade teacher, Judy Offerdahl, who had a class, and she decided to do something different during this moment. And she had all her students gather up the markers and the crayons and the construction paper, and they began to make cards to send to Blair Walsh. to uplift and lift up his spirits. This is what one of them said. It said, "Dear Blair Walsh, I know it can be hard to get through things that are sad, but you have to try and try again. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes." Now, as Mrs. Offerdahl had her students do that, I don't know that was that big a time for them. It was 20 minutes of construction paper and cutting and writing and doing that and sending it. And then they went on to lunch or recess or something else. And maybe it didn't make that big of an impression on them. But what do you think it meant for him? When he opened that first letter, after all the hate coming his way, read that letter from a first grader. I mean, that's God's time right there, opening that letter. Maybe that made all the difference in the world to say, oh, I can get through this. I'm going to live another day. It's going to be okay. And so as we think about how you and I engage in God's time, the miracle doesn't always come for us. It's not always that transforming when we engage in it. But what we do, sometimes it can make all the difference in the world. So how do we know? How are we spiritually attuned to know when it is God's time? How do we know the timing is right? How do we engage at the right time? Victor Shepard's a pastor, said maybe it has something to do with gratitude. That when we're open to gratitude in our lives and realizing even the little things, what we can be thankful for to God, that somehow we open ourselves up to the bigger picture. He was talking about a missionary surgeon that he heard speak one time, and he said this guy was pretty gruff. He said he kind of was pointed, and he kind of lectured us, where he kind of put us down for, why aren't you out there doing more, kind of thing, and you feel bad about it. And he said, he'd say stuff like, you North Americans aren't grateful for anything. He was a missionary surgeon in the Gaza Strip in some of the very poorest areas in the world and seen a lot. And so, when you get put down like that, you get the finger waved at you, sometimes that kind of washes over us and we don't really think much about it. He said, that was kind of happening. He said, but then he told this story that just kind of impacted me immediately. He was telling how he was there and he was operating on a woman, and he went back to check on her. He was in a little village, and she was just in a little hovel, a little hut, and she was doing well, which is great, and she was very grateful. In fact, she was so grateful she wanted him to stay for lunch. Well, he knew she didn't have anything. All they had was one Angora rabbit and a couple of chickens. And the rabbit, she and her husband, they'd comb it out, and the hair they'd comb out, she'd make into yarn to sell at the village. And the chickens is what they would use for their meals. They would eat eggs from the chickens every day, and that's how they got by. Very poor family. So he's thinking, I don't need to stay for lunch, but she's just impressed. I really want you to stay. So he said, okay, I've got another patient to check on. Let me go, and then I'll come back. So he leaves the home, and while she's beginning to prepare for lunch, and he goes and checks on another patient that he'd operated on, and they're doing okay, and he comes back, and it's about lunchtime, and he walks in, and something smells really good, and he sneaks in. He kind of wants to see what's in the pot. What is she preparing? And he kind of lifts the lid and looks, and as he looks in, he sees one rabbit and two chickens. She's given their livelihood away to him. Everything they had to eat, the gratitude that she had, she just gave it away. And he said, he wept unashamedly. Mary, she gave this expensive perfume to Jesus. It could have fed a family for a year. She just gave it to him because she knew this was the time. She knew this was the right time. It had to be expressed. It had to be given. As you and I engage spiritually with God, what we want to be is in tune, so that we can hear God leading us and nudging us, saying, now is the time to act, go and be. I think as we're more open to that, we begin to see Jesus more and more in the world, alive. When we engage in the right time, in God's time, it may not make a bit of difference for us. it may not impact us really. We may not even know what we're doing. We may just do it because we're people of faith and we know we are to do. But for the person that we engage with, for them, for that person, it becomes God's time. It becomes real, more real than anything else. It's all the world to them. And that is the Christian way. Amen. I invite us to pray together. Let us share in our prayer confession at this time. God, who seeks the lost, we came before you knowing that we have been lost on more than one occasion in our lives. When we search for meaning in security or possessions or personal glory, we may wonder why we aren't more fulfilled. When our greed keeps us from sharing what we have, we find ourselves aching and we don't realize why. Help us to find a deeper meaning within this great creation that you have presented us. Let us share your grace rather than hoard our treasures. Christ is present in more places than you think to look. Christ is surely present in the forgiveness that you receive today. Let Jesus not only be your Savior, but also your Lord. Amen. I'd invite us to affirm our faith together. This is the prayer of St. Patrick. As we have St. Patrick's Day looming before us, I invite us to share in this affirmation together. Christ be with us, Christ before us, Christ behind us, Christ in us, Christ beneath us, Christ above us, Christ on our right, Christ on our left, Christ where we lie, Christ where we sit, Christ where we arise, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of us, Christ in every eye that sees us, Christ in every ear that hears us. Salvation is of the Lord. Salvation is of the Christ. May your salvation, O Lord, be ever with